Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the IFCFJ's Pamela Howard Crisis Reporting, Global Crisis Reporting Forum. And I'd like to welcome you to this training with Raquel and Michael, who are both from the Climate, Diplomacy and Security Program at Adelphi. And on today's webinar, what we'll be drawing attention to is the link between climate change and conflict. In the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been much discussion about the green energy transition and fossil fuel reliance. And while Russia's economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas exports, and other countries buying these fuels may now be regarded as supporting the war effort. But that is just one example of how climate change and conflict intersect. In this session, our guests will look at how the impacts of climate change can contribute to conflict and the specific factors that drive conflict. And at the end of today's session, hopefully, we hope that you as a journalist will be better equipped to bring a climate change lens to your conflict reporting and a conflict lens also to your climate change reporting. And by way of introduction, Raquel, like I said, the both of them are from Adelphi, which is an independent think and do tank in Europe that is focusing on climate, environment, and development. Munayer is a consultant at Adelphi, where she conducts research activities on climate-related impact to security and fragility. And our focus lies on food security and food systems and how these relate to climate. While Michael, on the other hand, is a senior manager at Adelphi and he leads communication initiatives on climate linked risk to peace and stability. So I would like to welcome the two of you. How are you doing, Michael?
Thanks very much, Paul. Doing well. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Raquel, how are things over there?
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. All good.
Yeah, I'm really glad for the both of you to be able to join us today. And for all our attendees, if you are joining us on the Zoom platform and you have any question, please, you don't have to wait till the end of the presentations for you to ask the question. You can as well start putting them on the Q&A option on the Zoom platform. We'll get there at the right time. And if you're watching this video live stream on Facebook, please don't wait to do not hesitate to put your questions and comments in the in the comments box below the Zoom platform. And as usual, we are always excited to know where you are joining us from. So if you are with us here on the Zoom platform, to let our speakers have an idea of where you are coming from, joining us from, you can tell us in the chat box where you are joining us from, and we are glad to have you. So Michael, I know you have an extensively thorough presentation for us. I would not like to waste your time much further, so I think we should go right in, and I'll go back for the engaging interactive session.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Raquel is actually going to take us through the presentation in a bit more detail, and then I'll come back after she's talked through some of the ways that climate change and conflict interact in particular contexts, and suggest some ways that this could inform reporting and how to derive greater impact out of reporting onto this subject. So first of all, just a few kind of opening remarks. We wanted to offer this webinar and this training because obviously climate change and conflict is an important subject. Climate change is really the defining problem of our time. It's obviously very important how it relates to conflict. It can drive and fuel instability around the world. But actually these links aren't particularly well understood. You'll hear people often talk about climate change as a risk multiplier or a threat multiplier. Essentially the idea that climate change makes bad situations worse. And a lot of our work in the climate diplomacy and security program at Adelphi is about developing a more nuanced, more context-specific understanding of how climate change and conflict interact, so that policymakers and people working in the field have the tools to respond to these challenges effectively. There's a lot of attention on these links in the development space, in the climate change and security space. And I think increasingly journalists are looking to report on these kinds of stories but often the detailed understanding isn't there. So what we've done is adapted a training that we regularly give to people in the UN community, to other people working in peace, security, and development spaces. And we're going to talk about how, in particular contexts, climate change and conflict are linked. As Paul said, there's a lot of discussion around climate change and conflict in the context of Russia and Ukraine, the clean energy transition. But that's just one way of looking at it. So we'll be looking more at particularly fragile contexts where these dynamics play out in quite complicated and nuanced ways. So due to the time available, this is quite condensed. We're bringing together a lot of information, usually from longer trainings, into this session. But if anybody's good at quickly absorbing information, it's journalists. So I hope you find it useful and engaging. We'll be sharing our resource list, some slides, and be around, as Paul said, to answer any questions towards the end of the training. So I think with that, I will hand over to Raquel with just one point to add. I think in next week, we're hoping that our colleague Chitra Nagarajan, who's a researcher and a journalist that we work with frequently on our projects, will be here, and she'll be sharing lessons on how she interviews people, how she conducts research on the ground in these kinds of fragile contexts to draw out these climate security interactions and links. So please don't miss that. It'll be really, really interesting. But today, like I said, it'll be more on the bigger picture and how that can maybe inform your reporting as well. So let me hand over to Raquel, and she'll take us through the presentation there on the screen now.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I'll just jump right into it. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about the connection between climate change and security these days. So today we'll get into the specific ways in which these two relate. And to do this, I'll be using a lot of real life examples that will help demonstrate the issues we will discuss, but also to help you visualize them and perhaps identify them yourselves when you're reading or even covering a story or a context. But don't worry, just wanted to say that in the beginning, I won't be showing any graphics to demonstrate the climate is changing, because I suppose that if we are here, this has been established by now. So instead, we will focus solely on the specific ways through which climate change impacts peace and security. And what I like to do is to take you through 7 insights on climate impacts and peace. And except for the first insight, which is just something that you should keep in the back of your minds, the other insights, they're organized into pathways, because we hear a lot about climate change affecting so many areas which are related to insecurity, and how these in turn cause other insecurity impacts. So things can get a bit messy. And looking at these effects through clear pathways, it helps make sense of all of this, because we can then visualize not just the climate changing and the security situations arising, but also what happened between these two. So let's get started. As I just mentioned, this first insight is just something to keep in the back of your minds at all times when dealing with climate-related insecurity and conflict. Correlation does not imply causation. And this is something researchers like to say a lot, but it also has a very practical application in this case. And here's why. Our understanding about the links between climate and conflict has improved significantly over the past 10 to 15 years. And in the beginning, a lot of the research around climate change and security was focusing on the question whether there's a link between those two. But research has really moved away from this question of whether there's a link, because most researchers agree that there is, to focus more on questions of when, where, and how does climate change contribute to more conflict and insecurity, and when, where, and how does it undermine peace and stability. What the researchers agree on is that there is no simple and automatic causal link. So climate change will not always and everywhere automatically lead to more conflict, but it does depend very much on contextual factors. What we can see around the world is that climate change impacts, they converge with other pre-existing economic, social, political, and environmental pressures and shocks, such as economic exclusion, such as inequality, environmental issues, rapid urbanization. Those are just some of them. And climate change interacts with them and exacerbates some certain conflict drivers that will then undermine human security and peace, Actually, that is what is meant when we hear that climate change often acts as a risk multiplier, like Michael said. That means that it converges with these other pressures and exacerbate certain drivers of conflict. And thus, it is, and it will be always particularly problematic in these fragile conflict-affected contexts. But there are also specific context conditions that translate climate into security risks. And in the following insights, I will outline a number of these pathways through which climate change can contribute to conflict. And I'll try with these pathways to structure these links a little bit more, although it's important to remember that there are some generalizations. We're talking about general trends, so take it with a grain of salt, always with this topic anyway, because these dynamics will be very unique and specific for each context. This pathway is maybe the one that you're most familiar with, and it's about the impacts that climate change has on natural resources and also the competition over the access to and the use of natural resources. So we know that climate change can affect natural resources like water and land. And through these impacts, it changes access and availability to them. And in turn, this can increase competition and tension around them, around these resources, as well as around their management. And under certain conditions, especially if management institutions and government arrangements are dysfunctional, this can escalate into tensions and conflicts. But I'd like to make an important point here, because contrary to common belief, when it comes to resources, it's not just about less, not just about resource scarcity. We also have cases where more of a resource can lead to conflict. For example, if new water points are created in a certain area and not in another, there might be conflicts around them that were not there before. You might also have cases where there's resource scarcity in an area, so people move to another area where there is resources more abundantly, and this can lead to competition with receiving communities. So it's important to not just focus on understanding conflict in one area and also only in the terms of scarcity, but also at this broader context. So also climate change can affect shared natural resources. So for example, in many transboundary river basins, we see that they face an increase in demand due to economic development and population growth, but at the same time, a decrease in supply due to impacts of climate change and environmental as well. And this can spur conflict and also diplomatic tensions. And a few examples that can be seen in many parts of the Sahel, where conflicts between pastoralists and farmers, we hear a lot about those, as to who can use the little water and the land available are widespread in that region. And compounding this already complex competition of natural resources is the fact that who is a farmer and who is a herder is often largely dictated by ethnicity in sub-Saharan Africa. Not necessarily, but often it is the case. But also more broadly around the world, many parts of Latin America and also in Asia, we can see conflicts, especially around land access. All around the developing world, there's the widespread issue of land grabbing. So you have these more powerful economic actors taking land away from local communities. So, and by doing this, creating this breeding ground for competition over the little that is left for them. And up until now, I've focused on these dynamics at the community level, but we also have the second category of natural resource conflicts, which is between states. So for example, when natural resources are shared across borders. And today we can see it in big river basins where we have these combined pressures of the economic growth, the population growth, combined with the impacts of climate change on the resources. Up until now, we haven't seen this kind of disputes escalating into interstate wars. But the question is, as we move into the future, and these impacts that I've mentioned before, they're all increasing, will the management institutions, will they be able to continue managing these combined pressures, especially in the big river basins like the Nile, like the Mekong? So often the tensions that we are seeing at the moment are triggered also by large-scale infrastructure development. So for example, if the country that is upstream in the river develops dams for irrigation and the downstream country feels threatened or is concerned that this will reduce their flow of water. So in Ethiopia, they were building the Grand Renaissance Dam upstream of the Blue Nile, which is one of the main tributaries of the Nile. And Egypt, which is on the downstream, is quite concerned about these developments. So there have been ongoing tensions. I'm sure you've seen it in the media between Egypt and Ethiopia around the construction of the dam. At times, also with Egypt using quite strong language and threatening military action. So we're seeing this kind of tensions. Also in Central Asia, they deal with several issues regarding the sharing of water resources between up and downstream countries. And risk factors, they are, of course, very much at play when it comes to natural resource management. And there's actually a big body of research around conflicts related to resource management, natural resource management. And they all find that there are a couple of factors that increase the chance of competition and violence. One of them is history of conflict. So civil war, ethnic rivalries, interstate conflict, local conflicts. Those are conditions that help establish a culture of violence that weaken cooperation mechanisms. They also make small arms easily available. And this can lead to a situation where pre-existing non-violent tensions around the management of resources, they can more easily escalate into violence in light of changes to availability and to access. So in such cases is when we see climate change acting as the last drop in the bucket. Another important factor is that if groups are highly dependent on a specific supply of natural resources for their livelihoods and they lack alternatives, that can increase competition if there's an impact to that resource. So lack of livelihood diversity also piling on top of these existing pressures. And then we have inequality and marginalization. So the imbalances of powers and the rights between groups, who has access to land and water and who doesn't. It's a very important factor. In fact, inequality and marginalization within societies are reflected in issues of access to natural resources and the institutions that manage them. And unsurprisingly, unfortunately, gender norms and other identity factors such as ethnicity in caste-based societies, they often cross over with these issues of inequality and marginalization, with such groups being largely left out of the management of institutions and of decision-making around resources. And it's needless to say that this only increases the perils of these groups when it comes to access and distribution. So it can be a factor in the escalation of violence, of course. Now, what I want to talk about in this pathway, it moves a bit away from the focus on competition around natural resources, but it's certainly also linked to them. It's about livelihoods. So we know that climate change, through its impact on natural resources, affects livelihoods of those who depend on those resources. And as livelihoods are undermined, there are a couple of different things that can happen. One of them is that people can turn to adverse or illegal livelihood strategies. This is what we call maladaptation. And I'll give you a few examples, a few practical examples of this. So we have in Afghanistan, increases in droughts has played an important role in pushing farmers towards poppy production. So poppy is used to produce heroin, but they're also a very drought-resistant crop. So these farmers, they have found an alternative livelihood for themselves, but they are now inadvertently strengthening criminal networks and also, importantly, reducing the land available for food production. Another example is in Somalia. In Somalia, charcoal production is a very important alternative livelihood that has seen an immense growth in past years. And it's feeding back into more environmental degradation. So in a way, these survival strategies that people find for themselves end up undermining livelihoods for the future, the near future, and also decreasing their own resilience to climate change, sometimes even contributing to more climate change, if we think of all the forests that are cut down for charcoal production. Forests, they also provide food to indigenous populations, so this causes a further layer of fragility, as we've seen before with marginalization. And last but not least in this case, the charcoal trade in Somalia is directly linked to the financing of armed rebel groups. I'd like to mention even another adverse livelihood, because this one is increasing all over the world, as farming becomes more and more unpredictable and less profitable, it's small scale or artisanal gold mining. It's a very destructive activity for the environment. And although this is a bit of a global phenomenon, Ghana is a major example of it. So the water in Ghana is so polluted by mining activity, a lot of which is small scale and illegal, which means that it doesn't go through any form of control or doesn't follow any kind of standards, that the country is already running out of clean water today, not in the future. So Ghana might actually have to start importing drinking water in our lifetime because of this. These were just a few examples to demonstrate how this livelihood insecurity can be a push factor to other issues. Another of these is migration. And I'm talking more about the kind of migration that is internal. So from rural to cities, rural areas to cities. And if always when we talk about migration, it's important to underline that migration is and always was and still is and will be in the future an important coping strategy to deal with changes in climate and environment. So it's not necessarily, not inherently a negative development. But when it's unplanned, it can also contribute to instability and tensions in receiving areas because it can create some additional pressures on infrastructure and services, which then feeds back into other fragility dynamics. And we see this a lot in Latin America, with climate change impacting weather patterns in the countryside. But as people move to the cities, what happens is that they end up mostly in informal settlements, often in peripheral, vulnerable areas. So on hillsides where you have increased danger of mudslides when there's strong rain, which is often in Latin America, or in floodplains very close to river banks. So you have people moving to escape vulnerability, but they end up being more vulnerable to climate change, not to mention to other forms of insecurity that they will be confronted with in the form of marginalization, of urban crime, unemployment, etc. Another issue that I'd like to mention is around recruitment. So livelihood insecurity, it can make populations more vulnerable to the recruitment by criminal groups, by non-state armed actors, by militias, because there are often very little employment alternatives in the countryside, especially for young men when farming isn't working out as it should. And it has been observed that these groups, they're particularly active in recruitment in post-drought periods, settings, which was in recent years the case in Iraq and Syria. And you can look it up. There are a few studies on both these countries that confirm this connection, although there are other pre-existing issues as well. Now, just a quick word on gender norms, because they're important in shaping all these pathways and risks that I mentioned. Gender norms, they dictate who migrates and who stays back, for example, creating all these new sets of vulnerabilities to each of these cases. It's not only about women and girls, though. It's often about women and girls, but not only. There's also the issue of masculinity in shaping recruitment. So often you have masculinity issues with men's perceived responsibilities as breadwinners, and also the possibility of achieving a certain status. These can often play an important role in the decision of young people to join armed groups. And it's important to take into account when understanding the wider picture. And another pathway is related to food price spikes and food insecurity. So climate change impacts agriculture around the world, and that can contribute to volatility and shocks to food prices and food supply. And this can act as a catalyst for protests and political instability. Again, I will say that in several occasions, it's not the only reason why people start going to the streets. But if you have these already politically unstable situations, the quickly changing food prices will certainly bring people to the streets. And a famous example of this is the chain of events that happened in the Arab Spring, we call it, as we call today. Some of you may know this already, but right before the Arab Spring, between 2008 and 2011, food prices were skyrocketing. By the way, this photo in the background, that's from Syria from 2011. Here you see Syrian men waving these bread loaves during a protest against Assad's regime in Banya, which is a coastal town in Syria. One of the reasons for this upheaval were extreme droughts that happened in Russia, and they took place after a severe heat wave in 2010. Besides the droughts, it's also this heat wave also caused several forest fires in Russia, and this impacted also Russia's grain production. What happens is that to secure its own domestic supply at the time, Russia introduced an export ban on grains, which lasted just under a year, but the effects were very far-reaching. Pakistan and Egypt, they were the main importers, have suffered the most. So social unrest broke out in Egypt, and this ultimately shaped the entire region and turned into the revolutions that we know today as the Arab Spring. And I guess by means of this example, we can only imagine the kinds of impacts to food security and stability that will emerge from the current war, which is not just a ban limited to a to a period of time, let's say. And just as a side note, we at Adelphi, we've been working with this example for quite a few years now, ever since we put together a case study on this grain export ban a few years ago. And generally, participants are quite surprised to hear that there was this indirect link between climate change impacts on the one side and Arab Spring. But ever since the war started in Ukraine recently, and with all the reporting around impacts to grain exports and to food security that are emerging from it, I'm sure that at this point, this topic doesn't come as a surprise anymore. So I guess from this, we can only imagine how many pressing issues are out there that haven't received due attention yet. And just to come back to the issue of pre-existing aggravating factors having to be there, yes, they have to be there in order for conflict to arise, but the correlation is still there. And in this graphic, you can see that the FAO food price index between 2004 2011, which is the blue line represented by the blue line, and you can see the red lines representing the food riots and the protests. And what happened between 2008 and 2012 was that global food prices went up because severe droughts were hitting different producing regions at the same time. It was actually a global climate phenomenon that led to droughts not only in Russia, but also in Australia and US. We mentioned Russia separately because it was this added issue of the export ban. And that led to, or let's say contributed to, a whole bunch of protests in all these regions. And so export bans are one of the things that can exacerbate such crises. If you look at what countries are more at risk of these kind of food price spikes, it will be those which are especially dependent on food imports. And this map shows the cereal imports dependency ratio, particularly wheat, relevant for bread. And another I find really interesting factor is the role that subsidies play in all this picture. Because quickly changing food prices, they're often a problem, a bigger problem in those countries that subsidize certain staple foods. So in some countries, bread, for example, is subsidized by the state. And if you have a quickly rising global prices, the state might also not be able to provide subsidies anymore. So that means that in these places, prices will rise even more in an even shorter amount of time. And this is exactly what happened in Egypt in 2011. Now, in this new pathway, moving away a little bit from food security and from resources to another important topic, and I guess very important for reporting as well, extreme weather events. So when you have an extreme weather event hitting a country and creating disaster, you often have in the aftermath of the disaster, maybe a period of insecurity because the state might not be able to provide public security, perhaps crime might spike. But those are normally temporary. The state is generally then able to restore order sooner or later. But when disasters happen in succession, and also when the government is not able to adequately respond to the impacts, or perhaps when certain groups perceive being excluded from these responses, that can feed back into grievances and political instability, and ultimately even undermine the legitimacy of governments. And to demonstrate this, I'd like to bring up the example of floodings that happened in Thailand in 2011. So you had at the time the strongest monsoon rains from 30 years. 2 million people across 26 provinces were affected by these floods. And that happened in an already very fragile political situation because protests were going on against the government since 2008. There was a brand new government in power when the flood had happened. And this disaster was a bit of a test for the new government if they would be better able than the old one to address some of these grievances. But what happened is the reaction of the government and its aid was perceived by the population as not being transparent, as unfair, and it ended up amplifying these pre-existing grievances. So protests end up breaking out in the aftermath, and they continued until the coup of this government in 2014. Again, disaster was not the only reason, but it did feed into existing grievances and translated into political instability. And of course, also in the longer term, especially if you have a series of natural disasters hitting a country, this leads to severe economic losses, puts development further back, increases livelihood, insecurity in general, and it feeds back into all these dynamics that I was talking about before. Think of Haiti. This is a country that has been hit by several natural disasters in succession. But also to cite a positive example, because it's not all doom and gloom, and also to demonstrate that the opposite is also true. In 2014, I'm sorry, in 2004, it was a bit longer ago. In 2004 in Indonesia, the government has proactively used peace building as a response to the tsunami that happened in the northern Sumatra island. The country had been in civil conflict since the 70s. And right after the tsunami, the president at the time, he used that difficult situation to call on the population to unite for reconstruction. And this ended up culminating in a peace agreement between the parties. Now, yeah, this pathway is a little bit different in nature from the others, but it's important to keep in mind. We talked about how climate change impacts can contribute to insecurity, but also responses to climate and to security risks can carry their own risks. And we can think about our efforts to curb CO2 emissions. So 5, maybe 10 years back, a lot of countries, they were introducing quotas for biofuels for reducing CO2 emissions. But these fuels were they're often produced through cash crops like palm oil. It ended up leading to a global spike in land grabbing from local communities, creating these new localized conflicts. So this is an example of a policy that was used to mitigate climate change, but ended up having a negative unintended impacts down the line. And by the way, the same is for humanitarian aid. So to give you an example of how it can be problematic, in the Lake Chad region, so we looked at, you have these IDP camps. IDP stands for internally displaced person. And we saw that they would receive food supply in the camps, but not the cooking fuel to prepare the food. So people had, in the end, to leave the camps and move to areas that were controlled by armed groups and putting their own security at risk. And those who stayed also had to start cutting down the forest around the camps, which then, of course, lays the ground for climate risks in the future. There are also military and security strategies. They can also undermine livelihoods or coping strategies, because if you think about military actions, they often go hand in hand with restricting movement of local communities. So they might not be able to access certain areas for fishing or for farming. And also the opposite is true. So you have peace building strategies. If they do not take climate risks into account, it can also backfire. We had a project with WWF in Colombia. And we saw in this project that after the peace agreement between the state and the armed groups, the FARC, and the militia was demobilized, other groups moved into the forest areas that were previously controlled by them. And deforestation ended up increasing by 400%. So here's something that completely wasn't taken into account in the peace process. So what happens when these groups move out? And this is something we see a lot around the world, that climate and environmental issues do not generally play a role in peacemaking and peace building efforts, even though they touch upon primary elements of peace and security. And with this last insight, I just want to come back to the importance of context factors. So I talked about the role of dysfunctional governance institutions, the role of marginalization and exclusion in natural resource management, in the reaction to extreme events. But we should also not underestimate the risk of negative feedback loops, because certain areas are caught in climate and conflict traps. So you have conflict undermining livelihoods and weakening governance, and then people becoming more vulnerable to climate change as a result, therefore driving climate change to exacerbate these conflict drivers. And again, it's a vicious circle playing out over and over again. So the point about this pathway is that not only must we consider all the pathways I've mentioned so far, but also the fact that they interact and strengthen each other. But the good news is that feedback loops, they also work on positive effects. So one good deed will also have unintended, unexpected consequences down the line, because just as with the negative dynamics, also positive dynamics are interconnected and interact with each other and strengthen each other. So I hope this was clear and you enjoyed it. I would now like to pass the ball back to Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much, Raquel. Michael.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Raquel. I think it's obviously, quite a large and complicated series of interactions there. And there's a reason we often describe this as the climate security nexus, because of precisely these interrelating and interacting components. I hope that what this presentation gives you is a sense of the kinds of elements and the kinds of factors to keep an eye out for, and to be aware of as you're reporting on, for example, extreme weather situations, and how there may be an emerging or increasing risk of conflict going on around that because of some of the factors that Raquel has talked us through there, and that can be something that your reporting can be sensitive to. I'm going to move on just for the last sort of 10 minutes or so before we open up for questions, talk about a few different ways that I want to offer to help make reporting on these topics more impactful. I know that impact is understood quite differently in journalism, depending on who you ask. And I'll be talking about it particularly in terms of qualitative, positive contributions to solving situations, rather than in terms of audience reach or kind of quantitative perspectives. So there's a few things I'll cover. One is just this principle of first do no harm. The second is how solutions can maybe come into reporting. And third, how to some ways of connecting to different policy debates and processes. So beginning with doing no harm, as Raquel explained, the interactions between climate change and conflict are really complex. And going back to this first point about correlation and causality being distinct, we have seen oversimplified reporting on these links, and particularly that say climate change caused X conflict, climate change fueled emergence of terrorist organization, etc. And this leads to backlash, as you can imagine. We see on social media people saying, oh, look, here are the climate change people saying everything is about climate change. And there's a lot of nuance that needs to be included in discussing these topics. I think that goes for people who are writing up stories, but also it's something important for copy editors and community editors to be aware of. A headline or a tweet is often where these potentially damaging, quite simplistic narratives can emerge, even if the reporting is a bit more complicated. And there are other kinds of backlash that can happen. If something was oversimplified and we were to talk about, climate change is fueling conflict, therefore we need more militarization, then this can go in exactly the wrong direction, because as Raquel was alluding to, often what people need is support their lives, their livelihoods, their access to natural resources, and their relationships with their government. So these issues can lead into a very heavy security response, which is important, I think, to be aware of too. As Raquel also described, there's the issue with migration, that I think some people in reporting on and communicating as well about climate change and migration have emphasized the amount of migration that will be caused in order to spur action to mitigate climate change. And this can actually fuel harsher border policies and play into the hands even of people who are making money out of detention centers or other kind of businesses involved in the business of human mobility. So I think an important way to help navigate this, and of course I am a bit biased on this point, but there are experts working in this field, and we have a slide, I think, Raquel, if you could, yeah, which has a few different organizations that are working particularly on these complex climate and conflict interactions. And they also, I'm sure, be very happy and willing to direct you to other organizations in affected countries. These are particularly kind of global or global north organizations, but they do have strong networks. We'd also recommend the Climate Security Expert Network, which we manage along with the Berlin Climate and Security Conference, which brings together people, particularly in experts in affected countries, who could really help and guide, guiding reporting to keep it, making a positive contribution to the debate rather than a potentially negative one. Also, just to flag, UN Peace and Development Advisors are a fantastic resource on these topics, and often can be quite easily found just on LinkedIn or Twitter, and often very willing to contribute their expertise. So I hope it's not striking too much of a negative note to start with, but I think it's important to just to flag some of these issues, and then moving more to the positives. Then we can talk about solutions. The same experts and organizations listed here will often be identifying and promoting basically solutions to some of these issues, either through projects or just areas that deserve more attention. So I've been working with some experts on their research papers, and within a couple of those, there have been really interesting examples where they've highlighted projects that provide a way into solving some of these problems, but I think also, thinking in journalistic terms, bring the problem into relief with a positive example. So what do I mean? Well, for example, in Libya, there are these projects that are installing solar panels to generate electricity, but also doing it in a way that protects precious fresh water reservoirs from the sun, so to increase the water available for agriculture, increasing the water available for consumption by people as well. And this really brings into relief these two major risks that Libya is facing in terms of its reliance on fossil fuels for electricity, and also its dependence on fossil water that's buried deep under the Sahara for agriculture. So this project, these projects protect both of these things, and I think we have a great way into discussing these subjects, particularly if you work with images or video or audio, and it gives a positive framing rather than just discussing the affecting, speaking to people who are suffering from conflict or feeling the effects of climate change in a very pronounced way. I think in terms of impact, obviously this makes a difference to those projects if they're covered, but I think also for audiences, making these quite challenging and overwhelming topics seem less inevitable, seem like they are things that can be solved, and that there are solutions out there, I think makes a big difference to engagement and to can really help stories travel and generate interest as well. The third area I'll just cover quickly is to do with policy debates and processes. Again, the organizations and type of expertise on the screen would be able to guide these, but as Raquel was alluding to, there's always a political dimension to these topics. There are always a governance issue at play. There's often, the role of how governments are responding to crises, is the existing inequalities, and there's usually processes that people are pushing for in order to help alleviate those. So to go back to the example from Colombia that Raquel shared earlier, there are specific parts of the peace agreement that would actually be quite effective in helping reduce some of these risks related to armed groups moving into parts of the Amazon, and moving that process forward where they've been stalled would actually help alleviate things. So in my experience, you can be pretty sure that if you talk about a specific policy debate in reporting, anybody involved in it is going to read that article and is going to connect it and is going to use it in taking that issue forward. So in that way, articles can have more impact in their afterlife once they're out in the world, and give policymakers a basis for pushing a case forward. There's also a large international dimension to this. There's the question of cooperation between states on things like transboundary river systems or other transboundary environmental elements. And that can throw into relief, the difference in policies on one side of the border versus on the other. How is the situation different on one side? How is it different elsewhere, and why? And does that offer solutions that would help make the situation better in the country downstream or upstream, for example? And then sort of zooming out even further to this bigger international dimension, this whole subject of climate change and security occupies a lot of attention at the UN Security Council. And it might seem obvious that the Security Council should consider how climate change is impacting peace and stability around the world. But actually, despite a lot of pressure and movement on this from particularly small island states, global South countries, and their development partners in the North, there are other countries that are really pushing back on this. There was a UN Security Council resolution tabled in December with a lot of support from, I think, 113 countries, and Russia used its veto power to block that. And this ties into a kind of global geopolitical competing agenda story, right? That people want to be mandating the UN, and countries want the UN to have a greater mandate to work on these issues in countries that are heavily affected. And that runs into a bigger kind of international story, which I kind of ironically, I think, can in some cases bring the story home and make it more relevant to people who are perhaps in countries that are where their leadership is pushing back on this agenda, for example. So it's a few things to maybe bear in mind. Yeah, I'll wrap up there and hand back to you, Paul. I know we're skipping through quite a lot in quite a short period of time, but if anybody would like to ask questions, then we'd be really keen to engage a bit further. And our contact information is there on screen in case anybody would like to follow up about anything at all.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Can we stop sharing the screen? Yeah, so you've really left me with 5 minutes. around 5 minutes to engage, but I will do as much as I can. So interest around this subject has been around the issue of this approach potentially rejuvenating the interest in climate crisis reporting. And one of the shocking realities for me personally was looking at the outcomes of the response to the IPCC latest report, and that did not generate as much attention as it was supposed to generate. And which talked about potential fatigue among the audience and even journalists regarding climate reporting. Do you see this as very, very valid? And do you see this unique approach as capable of dealing with that fatigue? Let me start with Raquel. Then Michael can balance that. Are you there?
Sorry.
I think, yes.
Can you just, I didn't really understand the question exactly.
Okay.
At what point
okay.
you were,
The question
I'm
is
sorry.
this. If you look at the response to the IPCC report, it wasn't as serious in the media as it was expected to be. And even though there are other crises as well, like the Ukraine crisis, COVID pandemic,
So many
and
crises, yeah.
the American slap that reverberated across the world. We still have that. Journalists are, some people I talked to said maybe there is this fatigue around climate reporting, and there is nothing else that we can use to highlight its importance beyond the previous, something has to be done right now or never approach, that still seem to have failed to attract the right attention. So my question is this: do you see this approach as capable of bringing back attention and making, rejuvenating attention and interest among journalists and among the audience?
There are probably very many answers to this question, but I would focus on us. There's an entry point there on bringing attention to, we need to be resilient to crises because they just come from every direction, and we never know when they're coming. So we need to build in resilience. In terms of the reporting is always busy with what is happening right now, but this create, and this is understandable and correct in many ways, but we have to also address the why are we having these crises and why they're impacting us so much. But the fact that crises arise that will always be, this is probably something that's very inherent into the history of humanity. But the fact that it keeps sneaking up on us and we're never ready for them, and that is an issue that perhaps can be used also to connect these crises with one another. Also for us to see what the impacts of pandemic and of subsequent climate impacts, and then comes a conflict, and what will happen with societies, particularly fragile ones. Maybe Michael has a different answer.
Michael?
I think it's a great answer and great point about managing these and connecting these overlapping crises. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right, Paul, that there is this sense of fatigue, and I think it's valid in the we often, the climate crisis story is often approached as a science story, that there's a news element when there's an extreme weather event, or when there's a report from the IPCC, for example. I think what this approach, or linking climate change to human security and to conflict on the ground, can offer, is making this a story that is ongoing, is constant, and is very real and affects people's lives. If we take that example of the government response to an extreme weather event, there's a really long tail to that. Often the reporting around that will last a week and at most, and people will say, yes, this is connected to global warming. What happens after that, where communities might feel aggrieved, where there may be really very unequal response, that lasts months and years. And I think there are really important stories there that do come back to the climate crisis, and are ways of keeping attention on these issues and keeping it in the news cycle, because people's lives continue to be affected by these, and all these different pathways and dynamics that Raquel was presenting earlier are really the ways in which that happens. So I think there are really good opportunities and ways to dive into the subject in a way that's 365 days a year and isn't connected to these big report launches or extreme events.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would still like to squeeze two more questions into it. The other question that I think is also the issue that I think is also similar, beyond just climate, beyond just conflict, is the interest in preventive reporting, making preventive actions to still attract similar attention like response. It's just like, if you take this outside climate change, I will put it into health. There is these philosophies, Greek philosophies around Aegea and Panacea. Panacea talks about treatment, Aegea talks about prevention. But we don't see that interest in governments in committing resources to preventive measures, because like somebody says, these actions are not sexy enough in appearance. They don't give that superhero feeling that, yes, something comes and gets rid of the problem, since it has already dealt its action by preventing its occurrence. So what has been prevented may not be getting that more attention. And I also see the similar thing playing out here in the light of climate climate response and other conflicts. Efforts that could prevent all of these may not be getting as much attention as actions that would mitigate or deal with them or control them. So do you agree that this is so? And how can this also be integrated into this unique approach? Michael?
So it's a great question, and that's often something that we're encouraging actors across the the world of policy to take that preventative approach, and that relies on really getting into the understanding the root causes of climate-linked conflict and climate-linked instability. And I think, yeah, there are also good stories. I mean, the example I mentioned earlier of solar panels in Libya that also protect freshwater resources. That's preventative. Like the conflict risks, the instability risks in Libya, I mean, there are obviously ongoing issues there, but there's also things down the line that the country's facing, and that's a preventative story. And I think shining a light on these, bringing those into the spotlight, bringing the more of that lens into how these big crises are covered, and an awareness of what might be coming next is super important. Yeah.
Yes. Some more question, but one last question. So guys, we'll be having another session on this topic next week. So a lot of questions will be moving towards next week. Ideally, what would you like to see? What kind of changes would you like to see? What kinds of actions would you like to see journalistic? Let me start with you, Raquel. And by extension, if you can add something that I think journalists are getting wrong, that I think they can quickly get right. So Raquel will go first, then Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I think the issue of doing the bit more nuanced reporting and being careful not to use narratives that can fire up issues. Talk about migration that as a good example. We already have enough issues that people migrating have to deal with. They don't have to deal with more pressures. So that this being careful with how to frame narratives would of course be most important one. That's why we're also here talking about how these nuances. So looking, reaching out to these people who can help you filtering the narrative for it to be correct, that would be of public importance. What else can I mention now in the pressing second? Michael, maybe you want to take over. I'll see if I can think of something else.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, to me, that really is a key thing. I think I'd also say that under like asking people, and Chitra will pick this up next week and the next session, if you're reporting on all manner of things that are to do with people's livelihoods, their lives, there are questions that you can ask that draw out how climate change might be impacting that. If they're in a rural situation, is it easier or harder these days to farm the crops that they farm? How's the weather? What are you seeing? What are the changes you see in your environment? And then just bearing that in mind and having that as a lens that you bring into stories, I think can be really important. I mean, it doesn't then have to be the framing of the story. It doesn't have to make it a climate change story. But I think integrating this across all kinds of reporting would, I think, be really helpful in just making clear that the impacts of climate change aren't temporary, they aren't short term, but often they're really there and they're impacting people's lives now. It's not a future risk.
Yeah, thank you very much, the both of you. I know you really went through a lot today, and it's something we appreciate. And our community, don't worry. Okay, we'll get back to that. So don't worry. I know you have a lot of interest then. So next week we are going to take a different approach to the same subject matter, in which we are going to be getting practical tips on the subject from a practicing journalist and activist. So that promises to be an exciting one. So on behalf of the ICFJ community, I'd like to thank Michael and Raquel for making it today with us, and for sharing your insight, for everything you've done, for being incisive for that beautiful presentation, which I look forward to sharing with our forum members, those that are here with us. Zoom, if you are here on Zoom and you are not part of our community, please we are a very active group on Facebook, and that is where we'll be sharing these results, these slides that Michael and Raquel that they've used today. So go to facebook.com, search for ICFJ Pamela Howard Global Crisis Reporting Forum, request to join, be part of it, and we are going to share it with you when you're a forum member. And to learn more about this forum, please visit www.icfj.org, and you can also access more resources for your journalism career by visiting IGNet website on www.ignet.org. And until we reach you again next week, where we'll be discussing this insightful topic and very, very relevant and unique and quite interesting approach. I find it quite interesting for journalists to be able to expand their ability to report these issues and more. Bringing more issues together in the same story allows you to see it from different lens, enriches the reader's experience, and also broadens your capability as a journalist. So we'll be joining you again next week, and I say have a great day, and bye Raquel, bye Michael.
Thank you,
and
bye.
thank you for
Thanks so
joining
much
us today.